So for my next project, I'm going to be showing you how I made this, and this is a Shishi Odoshi Japanese style bamboo water fountain. The rough translation of that is deer scare, because the tapping sound of the bamboo pivoting back from losing the water is supposed to scare away deer. Now this project I spent little to no money on because all of the supplies I had. But if you had to buy all of the supplies I bought, I still think you can make this for easily $100. And if you're plan ahead and find neighbors with bamboo, or collect some rocks, or have some vessels laying around, you could build it much cheaper than that, which is still cheaper than the commercial grade ones I saw online. I usually don't have build times for projects, but this was actually a Father's Day gift, so if you're watching this video, you most likely will not be able to make it in time for Father's Day, since I believe I'm posting it on Father's Day. But it was a last-minute concept, a last-minute ideal, and I pulled it together in about a day and a half. So it could be a quick one as well. I wanted to stick to using the bamboo only for the delivering the water to the elements of this fountain. Because bamboo is actually a grass, it becomes very brittle once it's dry, and I didn't want it to have any support, to rely on it to support any of the pieces. So I had this piece of cherry from a project I did probably about 5 years ago, making some logs, and I've kept it in my shop because it's a really pretty piece of lumber. I wanted to save it for something special, and this is a great project for that. Cherry looks great on its own once it's finished. So that was a 4-foot piece of cherry that I cut in half, and I didn't like the two sizes being the same size, so I cut about 6 inches off the other piece. So I'm working with about a 24-inch piece and then an 18-inch piece. So because this is from an older project, I already had the front face planed pretty well. I was originally, when I took it as the cutoff, thinking of turning it into a bench, but it was just really narrow. So I didn't have too much to do to the face, but the backside I wanted to add some depth and character to it, just so that when I finished it, because this is going to be clear coated, there's a little more visual appeal than just a rounded flat back. So I used a sanding disc on my grinder to just kind of round over all the corners and edges and make it look a little more appealing than just a slab of lumber. So this came off of a cherry log, and like I said, it was a project I did, I think probably about 5 years ago. So it was fairly fresh when I cut it off and took it back to my shop. So there was a little bit of a split in the front face, and the face was a little warped even though I had planed it years ago. So I used my belt sander just to even out that flat front, and since cherry, the color of it changes more drastically than other species of lumber as the years go on, and since I was going to clear coat it, I wanted to start with an even look to all the wood. So I took that aged face off of it as well, and then I used my orbital sander to kind of clean everything up. So same process for the piece that's going to hold the spout. The bottom of it wasn't square, so I squared it up with my circular saw, and then I put it in my vise to add that texture to the back side of it. So for this one, I didn't necessarily want a full flat top. I wanted a flat top just because my dad really likes LEDs and LED gadgets in the backyard. So I wanted something up there. If you wanted to add some sort of decorative element to it, you could. I didn't want it completely flat. That doesn't have a ton of appeal, so I rounded over that hump on the top. So the pattern in the cherry is going to be really pretty, and by exposing more surface area at different angles of that, the figure will end up looking nicer. So I rounded over that top, and then I flipped it around in my vise and added some detailing to the back. So after that, I had to find some bamboo, and you'll see in the video it was a real pain finding a good source of bamboo. But once I had that under wraps, this is obviously green bamboo because it's freshly cut. It's cheaper than getting it online, and since I'm only using the bamboo for the spout and the tipper in this fountain, If it doesn't dry properly and it splits, I could always just replace them. And the nice thing about having a whole piece is I was able to play around with the acoustics of parts of the bamboo and the thickness of the bamboo walls in order to get the sound I wanted. So the vessel for this is actually something I took from my parents. Years ago they got a rain chain, a Japanese style rain chain for one of their gutters, and it didn't work the way they wanted. So this is the bowl that it was at the bottom of the rain chain that collected all the water, and it's made of copper. So I cleaned it up with some barkeeper's helper, which is great stuff around the shop. I use that to clean my tabletop on my table saw. I didn't want to take it completely back to raw copper, but I wanted it to look more antiqued, so I took off kind of that oxidation that was on there naturally, and you'll see it was a little more antiqued, and you could see the copper a little better once it was clean. But the nice thing, as you could see as well, is since it had a connector for the rain chain, when I took that connector out, there was already a hole in the bowl, so I didn't have to ruin this nice copper bowl by drilling a hole in it. But since I had this laying around, it was free. You could essentially use any sort of vessel that you want that has a hole in it. So even those decorative planters will work. Anything you're willing to put a hole into it, you could use as the water catcher for this. So then I used the vessel to figure out the height of the tipping part of this fountain, and I wanted that because I don't want the bamboo to hit the fountain at all. I only want it to hit the rock at the end of the pour. So I found center, or about center on my cherries. It's an oblong piece of cherry, and then marked the width of the bamboo because I wanted the style of this, I wanted the bamboo to go through the cherry. There's many different styles of these. You can Google image them and see which one you like, but I like the one where the bamboo was embedded in the cherry, and it will also make it easily replaceable. So I think I needed to cut out about 1.5 inches opening for that bamboo. I made it a little bit bigger because, like I said, if I ever have to replace it, you want a little play there. So I used a 3/4 inch spade bit and just drilled a whole series of holes in somewhat of a random succession so that it would be easier to cut out the excess. So then once I had that, I was able to take my jigsaw and square up that hole. The jigsaw blade wasn't deep enough in certain parts, so once I finished up with that, and also to clean up the hole, I used a long Dremel bit on my rotary tool and cleaned up that opening. So I final sand all of this in the end, so all of this right now is rough sanded, but after I had that opening complete, I was able to test the rocking action on that bamboo and make sure that was going to clear the pot. So once all that looked fairly sound, I had to drill a hole through the center of my piece, and then through the center, all the way through the center of that opening I just made as well, in order to hold that bamboo in place. So I used some clamps, my drill press. I have a really long 1/4 inch drill bit, so that was what I had to go with by default, was a 1/4 inch opening. And I'm going to be using metal to go through this so that I don't have to worry about pieces getting wet and swelling. And I was able to drill about halfway through that hole, and then I had to raise my table saw fence and raise my drill press table and drill the rest of that hole. So then what the shaft I'm using to hold that bamboo in place is I have these long, they're like 3/16 of an inch, pretty skinny bolts. They're almost like carriage bolts. I don't know what they were used for, but I have a bunch of them. So I drilled a smaller hole in the bamboo and then used that to connect the whole piece, and it works pretty well. I ended up trimming down that bolt because it's too long, but I don't remember if I show it in the video, so I'm mentioning it now. So I'm using a small pond pump for this, and that is what's going to bring the water from the vessel I have up to the bamboo. And I've had this pump for probably 10 years before I even started my woodworking business. I kind of checked online, and you could get these for less than $20. So that is a 1/2 inch opening in that palm pump, which means the inner diameter of that plastic tubing is a 1/2 inch and the outer diameter is 5/8, which is important for drilling holes later in the project. And this pumps it up about 3 feet. I have the setting set to minimum so that it doesn't drip full speed. So then, now that I had the palm pump working, that cherry, I wanted to make it a little bit smaller just because that pump's kind of old. I didn't want to have to rely on pumping it as far as it was capable of pumping. And then I wanted to split this cherry in half so that I could drill a recess and hide all of the mechanisms with that pump. So the tubing is going to go inside this standing cherry. So I did that on my cross-cutting sled and it wasn't long enough, so I ended up having to hand cut it and then plane down the face a little bit. I have a rounded bit for my die grinder. Someone gave me a bunch of these bits a little while ago and they are just completely invaluable in the shop. So with that rounded bit, it was pretty much the width I needed it to be. So I just went down the opening of that cherry on both sides and created a nice large recess for that tubing. I made it oversized so that I could slide the tubing in easily. So then I tested out to make sure that pump would work, and I don't have this in slow speed because I ended up switching out that piece of bamboo, but essentially it worked that first go around. So then I needed to put the spout on that tall piece, and this is going to be kind of a mirage. In order to get that tube in, I'm going to slide it in the back of that piece of bamboo. You can't really see it in the way I have the camera cropped. You can see it there. That tube fits in the back of that bamboo perfectly. Since I had that long stalk, I could pick a piece that was wide enough for it. And then I'm just going to have a dummy piece sticking out the back end. So it will look like it's a through piece, but it's really not. So once I figured all of that out, I glued back together this piece, and I wanted it to set up quick enough that I could work on it. So I put some dollops of epoxy in certain spots and then wood glue in other spots and clamped the whole thing together. This was kind of risky because I hadn't run the plumbing through it before I did this, but I figured my opening was big enough that I could glue it together, cut some holes, and be able to slide the plumbing through without a problem. Then with that drying, I started playing around with the tones of different types of bamboo. That first one I used wasn't working great. So you're basically trying to get, you're going to have a pivot point that's a little bit past center on the piece you're cutting. And bamboo has central nodes in them. And I was trying to get the tip through a node because that is going to be the strongest point of your bamboo. But I found that acoustically, and I'm sure someone who knows more about the physics of pipes, these almost act like organ pipes, I want to say, or even whistles, will be able to better explain this. But I found if you had 2 nodes in the bamboo, it sounded better when it smacked against something. Also, the parts of the bamboo closest to the root are going to have the thickest walls on them, and the thicker the walls, the nicer the sound as well. You could see the last piece I held up had that nice thick wall, and that one sounded the best. So I'm not going to lie, I ended up making a bunch of those pieces in order to get this to work, because you have to drill your hole on the opposite side of one of those nodes, and trying to find a piece that had enough in the front to hold water to make it tip was a little bit difficult. So I'm going to, once I get this working, I'll put the final dimensions of the piece I ended up using and where I ended up drilling my hole. You can see I kept playing around with the weight, because the weight in the back is what's going to help it return and how high up in the air it is. So I did end up playing around with this a little bit. So like I said, the nice thing about this design is I could switch out that bamboo. So once I had a piece that was working fairly well, I went through and I started final sanding this one piece of cherry. So I cleaned up that inner edge, even though you won't really see it. I cleaned it up, and then I went through, starting at 80 grit to 120, final sanding that piece, because this is going to get a clear coat. So in order to attach this to the ground, I had some rebar laying around, and I came up with this idea to embed some rebar into the piece. So this is 5/8 inch rebar, so I'm drilling 1/2 inch holes. So it will fit in there if you hammer it in, so it will be really solid. And then all I have to do is stick it into the ground. Because this has to be lined up perfectly, by doing this I can readjust these pieces in order to get all my elements to fit. I'm not super patient when it comes to drying time for glue, so I left this in the clamps as long as possible, and I started cleaning up the edge, because when you glue something together like this, it never is going to realign perfectly. I was mostly worried about that front joint, the one that you're going to see the most, lining up perfectly. So we took the angle grinder and started to clean this up as much as possible while it was still in the clamps. So after letting this set up for a good part of the day, I took it out of the clamps, potentially a little earlier than I should have, and then I started cleaning this one up as well. Same process. I don't think I showed in this video, but that portion you're seeing in the center of that front face is actually a natural crack in the wood, and the back side didn't line up as perfectly as the front, so I went through with some epoxy and filled cracks in both of the pieces. Once those were sanded, I gauged by eye the angle and height I wanted for that spout, and once it looked good, I just drew a rough angle on the front and on the side, which I transferred to the front. And then in order to freehand drill that angle, I just propped it up until that line I marked was about perpendicular to the floor, which would then give me the angle once it's not propped anymore. And I drilled that hole, and this is a 1-inch spade bit I'm drilling in there. The one problem with bamboo is it's going to be uneven across its entire surface, with the nodes in each piece, and the fact that it is a grass. I mean, trees are like this as well. You're not going to have a perfect circle to work with. And then you could see how I'm just going to kind of have that facade resting in there, so it looks like one full piece of bamboo, but in actuality it's two. So then it came time to put all those pieces back together, and then I could start fitting this into the spot I wanted to put it in. So you can see I cut that bolt down, and this is a completely different section of bamboo than any I've already shown in the video. And then for the plumbing on the other piece, I was able to quite easily run it through the bottom and have it come out the front hole. I just had to use some pliers in order to pull it out. And then I just fit that piece of bamboo on the edge. I might, once this is all set up and ready, put some epoxy on that, but in order for the water to it would have to backflow out of that because it's on a downward angle. Also, another thing that's not in the video is I cut about a 30-degree decorative angle on the edges of both of these, and then I guess this also isn't in the video. After this step, I hammered the rebar into the bottom of both pieces. In order to put this all together, the vessel that's going to be catching all the water is a small pail. I picked one with a mouth on it so that I could slide the tubing through without jamming it up. So I just dug a hole and stuck the pail in there, and you could see that that copper bowl will sit on top of it perfectly and drain into it, and you won't see it. So then this is aligning the first piece, and I basically just eyed it. It was a little tough because the rebar so far, it was hard to tell where exactly it was going. I ended up adjusting each of these once or twice, which wasn't a huge deal. But once I got this one in and kind of tested it out, I stuck the other one in. And at this point, even though it looks bright in the video, I was losing daylight, and my battery dies about halfway through putting this one in. So I'm going to have to come back the next day and finish this up, and I'll show you. I also painted these and I put the first coat of finish on them, and that won't be in the video either. So I thought I was going to have a little bit more work than I actually had to finish this up. I wanted to cut that pipe because if you have any minor kinks in that pipe, it will ruin the flow of the water. And to keep it at a minimal flow, I have the pump set all the way to low. So any little kink, and it's going to really disrupt what is coming out of that spout. So I ended up being able to push it enough down the bamboo pipe that I didn't have to cut it, and then I moved that back piece about 2 inches forward once I had the flow going, so you could see what it was, what the speed rate was coming out and where it was going to land, and then this ended up working perfectly. I had a bunch of rocks laying around that I've collected over the years, or people have given me. A lot of them are from Cape Cod, and I put those in the bottom of the pan, and then that was pretty much minus finishing the coat at the end. So this is that finished fountain, and I honestly thought I was going to have to mess with it more today. Last night I left it with, it wasn't working perfectly, and I hadn't put a coat of sealer on these yet, but you can see I put a coat on it. I'll put another coat on as well. They'll probably get 3 coats, but that is pretty much going to be the finished color. But I thought I was going to have to clip the rubber hosing, but what I did was I actually just kind of pushed it all the way to the end of that one spout. You can't really see it up there, but it is up there, which is nice because now I don't have to worry about it leaking out there at all. And I have my pump set at the lowest setting, so it really is just a trickle, and this is supposed to be a slower pace mechanism. You could turn up that water and have it constantly pounding. It goes off about every 10 to 12 seconds, which I think is a good pace for this. And lastly, what I did is I just had to move this one about 2 inches closer to line it up perfectly with this one. So the nice thing about that rebar is not only are these not going to move, you can cement them in if you want, especially if you live in an area where you get a deep, heavy sort of frost. But I just kind of played around with moving these. I think I moved them 2 or 3 times each, and it wasn't too bad. But right now I've had this running for about 20 minutes or so, and it's been going pretty well without a hitch. So you can see I added that piece in the back, so it looks like a full piece of bamboo is going through there. This piece that is knocking is not a super loud tone. I was kind of looking for a louder tone, and I don't know if that is more so from watching the movie, and since it is a silent scene, that sound is so prominent. I don't know if this was much louder, if it would get annoying because it's right next to a table, but luckily with having bamboo right across the street, I could play around with that piece if I want. So for final dimensions on mine, you're looking at about, with the piece going into the wood, about 11 inches. And then, like I said, I just cut these at a decorative edge, and this one right here is about 1 inch. Is about 26 inches long. Same thing. I just kind of eyed this cut. You could see that the one node is right there, and I drilled my hole right behind that node. You can't really see it, but the drill's right behind that node, and I have 2 nodes in it. I found with 2 nodes the sound is much better. Then I have a little piece hanging off the end as well. So that's a 26-inch piece, which means that my point of my drill is a little over halfway of that 26. It's at about 15 inches. 15 inches is the point I drilled that. The finish I'm putting on this is a spar varnish that's especially formulated for outdoor applications that specifically are going to get wet. I feel like if there's a boat on the front of your paint can, that is a good sign that is a quality exterior finish. And this is going to be 3 coats. Right now I have 2 on here,